Well, it's our last week of class. I get the feeling that I will be cutting some slides from the end of the slide list for the final next week, simply because I don't see how we're going to get through it all with only 2 classes left. We're going to continue with Impressionism today, work into Post-Impressionism, and round out the 19th century, actually see some stuff from the 20th century, as we talked about that. But that should wrap it up, and that means your slide list is roughly 30 rather than 35, which is probably even better for you as you begin. So as you're beginning to study, and I will get that PowerPoint going, right? Katrina asked me after class, where's the PowerPoint with the slides? And I'll get that up today. This afternoon is catch up on all sorts of stuff. So long story short, the slide list will be shorter. We'll talk a little bit more about it on Thursday. I get a feeling Thursday, while I'll be presenting some new material, there'll be time at the end of that to talk about the final strategies for success and whatnot. It won't take up the entire class with lecture and slides, right? So there we are with that. You have all the stuff you need to begin studying already, with the exception of that PowerPoint with the slides. But you can go back and find them all in the other PowerPoints, because they're all up there one way or another. They just haven't been consolidated into one file for you yet. Right? So we were talking about Impressionism at the end of class on Thursday, and we were talking about the fact that it can best be understood as an outgrowth of the Realist movement from the middle of the 19th century. Remember that the Realist movement was very much politically motivated, in that it grew out of the Third Revolution in France, which brought sort of social change, brought to the forefront the plight of the working poor, led to Napoleon III, which also brought about major changes to the city of Paris. And all of these things seem to have inspired the realists in one way or another, right? To focus on making a modern art for the modern world, a realization that the Industrial Revolution had very much changed the fabric of society by the middle of the 19th century, and that the world was really obviously, demonstrably different than it had been for the previous generation. And what we find, beginning with the Realist period, is an attempt to make an art that addresses the modern experience, that is a modern art for the modern world. And what that means is the realization that the modern world is so different from centuries past that why should the art look the same? If we're trying to make an art that really reflects the concerns of the modern world, then why does it have to be so traditional? Why do we have to go back to Renaissance ideas of perspective, right? The Academy's way of approaching paint as a blended to fool your eye into thinking that you're looking at something other than a surface, you know? Why should we kowtow to the traditional rules if really what we're trying to do is to make something that reflects a modern experience that is ostensibly different, right? And so that really begins with the Realist movement, and the Impressionist movement is an outgrowth of that, right? Because like the Realist movement, it shares an interest in changes to society, in the impact of industry, right? Making a modern art for the modern world, right? It's also, on a certain level, a bit traditional in that, like Romanticism, there's this interest in the impact of industry. We saw that going back even before the Realist movement. Constable is interested in the impact of industry by turning his back on it, right? By looking for a simpler way of life where industry hasn't affected anything. And Monet's picture is really similar. It's kind of romantic in outlook in a way. Romanticism doesn't just go away, you know? Those ideas kind of hold on in some people's minds. And Monet has gone back home, like Constable did, right? This is Le Havre. This is where he grew up. This is what a harbor that looked different when he was a kid than it looks now in the 1870s, right? And he goes back and he sees this sort of juxtaposition between old ways of life, the fishermen independent in their boats, silhouetted against the sunrise, and the new way of life, which is industry. These large masted ships, these cranes, loading things onto those larger ships in the background, sort of obscured in the mist. Right? Constable goes back home, right? Finds this farm where the farmer never left home, 4 times by the time he was 80. Where there are no bridges, there are no paved roads. Right? A simpler way of life, man in harmony with nature, right? Monet might be picking up on that. The fisherman in the foreground is man in harmony with nature. The industry in the background, out of sync, right? These ideas seem to percolate through because so much of artists' ideas draw on earlier artists' ideas. Right? Now, what are the differences? What's new with Impressionism? Right? First and foremost, they are working independent from the academic structures, the main structures of society. So they have rebelled outwardly against the French Royal Academy, which had dominated art production, had set the rules, had determined what is good and what is bad since the late 17th century. Right? So for over 200 years, right, artistic life in France had been dominated by the Royal Academy and remains so even after the royals are gone. Right? They still call it the Royal Academy. Right? Now it's the Academy of Fine Arts, but still same group, right? And they've outwardly rebelled against it. So that's one thing that's different, right? Is that they are working outside of the traditional structures. They are taking that idea of rebelling against tradition one step further. And part of this is because the Royal Academy, who sponsored the annual Salon, had rejected them so many times. Right? The artists that ended up forming the Impressionist group had been rejected so many times that they just kind of gave up. We've had it. Right? We don't believe that they're judging on solid criteria. So we are going to go out on our own, and we will be our own juries of our own works. And it's for this reason that the first Impressionist show opens 2 weeks before the Salon. That's absolutely key. Because they can then argue it's not that we got rejected. We're not putting this up because they wouldn't want us. We don't want them. Right? This is not because we've been rejected this year. We are usurping that role ourselves. Right? And this leads to really the modern system of buying art. These days when you want to go see modern art, what do? You don't go to a museum. You go to galleries. That's where the Impressionists had their first show, was at a gallery. Right? People flocked to it. It was a huge show, right? 30 different artists, many with multiple works in the show. It was a massive, they had to rent a space big enough for it, right? But this sets up the sort of tradition, what has become the modern tradition of where you go see contemporary art. I mean, we have contemporary museums. The Hirshhorn's doing a great job, right? National Gallery puts up some contemporary stuff, right? Small area of it. But for the most part, you should go to galleries to see this thing. And that's really born with the Impressionists, right? The idea of the independent gallery as a place to go see cutting-edge, important contemporary art, rather than at the Salon, sponsored by the state, right? Second big thing, they're working outside, right? They're painting on site, en plein air. Now, they're not painting the entire thing on site. We know that from scientific studies of the layers of paint that are on the canvas. We know that significant portions of this had to have been completed back in the studio. But because they have tube paint, right? Little metal tubes of paint like you can buy down at any art store now, were first developed in the 1850s. They've got these now. They're commonplace. They can paint outside in a way that artists prior to them could not. Very easily. Get a box, right? You've got your brushes, a bottle of turpentine. There you go, right? You're set to jet. So they're painting outside. They're beginning these things outside, finishing them in the studio. But one of the things that they're trying to do is to give the, dare I say, impression that the entire thing was done outside. And as we look at details of these, what we'll see is there are often places where you can see the bare canvas sticking through, as if it were unfinished, as if it were a sketch, put up as a finished work of art, signed, dated, completed, right? When do you sign anything? When it's done, right? a contract. You don't sign a contract as a draft form, right? You finish it, you sign it. Monet's work is signed, but we can still see in the upper left corner that to get the light coming through the sunlight, there are areas of bare canvas poking through. And as we see some details around the toll house on the bridge, there's some bare canvas that sticks through, right? But there are other areas that are paint layer on top of paint layer on top of paint. So it had to have been done over the course of hours. But the idea is that it looks spontaneous, painted outside there, making that part of the message, if you will, that it's painted outside, right? And that message of being painted outside is, I think, really the most important thing about many of the Impressionists, is that they are interested in light. The relationship between paint and observed color and light, right? Even though they shared the realist interest in modern life, and we can look at the bridge at Argenteuil as being a symbol of modern life, this brand new highway bridge that connects the suburb of Argenteuil to the city of Paris, right? This is where Monet chose to live, outside of the city, right? And he focuses on this monster new construction, modern life. At the same time, that's only part of what he's interested in. He's really interested in the play of light. And this is part of the reason he chooses the town of Argenteuil. Argenteuil is where the Seine River, right after it wafts its way through Paris, working its way all the way toward where it empties into the North Sea at Le Havre, which we see on the right. But it widens here as it works its way out of Paris. And there are islands, right? And it sort of slows down and gets very wide and very, very calm. And it was a weekend destination for people because you could rent a sailboat, like you see here, right? It was just a nice place to go get out of the city, right? The industrial city for the weekend. Enjoy yourself outside. And that's what Monet paints, and that's why Monet likes it here, because as the Seine widens, right, not only do you get the sort of the sunlight unobstructed by buildings, right, but you also get reflected light coming off of the water, right? So that light sort of bounces everywhere. And what Monet does with the bridge at Argenteuil, what Monet does with lots of his paintings, is he'll paint the same thing over and over and over again, with the idea that every time he paints it, the light's going to be different. Why paint something more than once, right? If you like the way it looks, that's one thing. But if you paint them multiple times and you see them side by side by side by side, you start to look at other things rather than just the bridge. You start to look at how the bridge looks on a partly cloudy day, or mostly sunny day. Maybe that's a better way to put it. Mostly sunny day. A day not unlike today. Cool air, breezes, right? Pleasant day to be outside, rather than a stupid art history classroom with the lights off, right? Paints it again on a gray day. Looks different that way, right? Rainy day looks different that way. Full sun looks different that way, right? And you start to understand that what Monet is really every bit as interested in as he is in the effects of modern life is the effects of light. And the relationship between these paints that he can use differently now and the effects of light. Right? So I've got some details that may help with some of this. So when we see him painting, look at the way the water is built up. Sometimes we can see as he's laying in the paint, knowing that oil paint put on thick will stay wet for a good while. Okay? Sometimes he's pushing the paint wet into wet, but sometimes he's laying the paint wet over the top of dry. And what that means is that when you get that effect, it had to have sat for a while. He can't have been painting it as these clouds move past, right? By the time he lays wet over dry paint, right, the lighting will have changed. Right? But he wants it to have this effect of looking as if it were quickly painted and leaving the brushstrokes unblended, right? Yellows adjacent to blues and greens, right? The parasol of the woman in the rowboat, presumably the woman with the man rowing, right? Paint with just a couple of dashes of paint, right? Really quickly painted, or so it seems, right? That gives the effect of a moment, an instant, which adds to the idea that he's painting light. Because light flickers, light changes every moment, right? The light in this room will change from the moment the class started to when it's over. The light in this room will be different. And Monet gives us that idea that light is his focus, light is what he's interested in, the changing nature of light, right? The changing nature of the world around him. Even the bridge itself, right, becomes this multicolored surface as the light hits the water and then goes up on the bridge. And so ostensibly a gray stone structure is really filled with all of the colors we see in the rest of the composition. Because the light is reflecting on it, right? And then you can see a detail, for example, up here, where I was talking about before, where the white of the canvas shows through, right? Where he makes it appear as if he's not really even finished the picture, which adds to the sense that he's attempting to capture this momentary, instantaneous effect of light at a particular instant, right? This is why the name Impressionism was given to them. First as a criticism, but they took it as their own, right? Because it seems as if it's how it impresses you, right? That momentary sort of glance or regard of how it looks at that particular moment. Right? Now, as I mentioned before, he painted the same thing again and again and again. Right? It's different viewpoints, different kinds of weather, different lighting effects. And he would show these together in the Impressionist shows side by side, sometimes upwards of 10 of them as a series. And when you see 10 bridges at Argenteuil at a series, what you end up focusing on is how is the light different? How is the ambience around the bridge different? How does the viewpoint and its change my perception of it? So in these two paintings, it's the same bridge, and with the one on the left, he's sort of over here, right? Looking that way, looking across the panel. And I think he's either just chose to omit the boathouse, just leave it out, which also adds to the sort of constructed nature of this Impressionist idea, or I've not been here, and even if you go, it's industrialized now, like, right, it's Crystal City or something. It's just, big buildings. And I drove by Argenteuil, I was going to stop, get some pictures for class, right, strip malls. Worse than that, big boxes, Best Buys and whatnot. But you imagine he's probably over here on this bank, and he could be looking past the boathouse through here, or he's just decided to leave it out. Or maybe it's a floating boathouse. Maybe it was downriver that day, right? But each one of these gives us a sense that there's a realism to the way he's painting it, but at the same time, each of the pictures is trying to achieve not so much an interest in the bridge itself, although that's still there, right? From the realist, it's a modern symbol. But what's interesting Monet equally is the idea of the play of light, the relationship between his new tube paints and achieving a particular momentary coloristic experience. We have 3 of these around here of the highway bridge. Here I believe we're on the other side of the bridge down at the far end, and looking sort of across from the opposite side of the bridge that we can't see in the picture here. So looking up this bank here is sort of behind the structure as well. But again, as we see these each one in series, we end up getting this sense of how light affects our perception of structure, right? Of the elements within the picture. That becomes every bit as important as the bridge itself, which is not to say that the bridge is unimportant, right? So Monet is very much a painter of light, right? Which is a difficult thing because light itself is non-existent in a way, right? It's not physical. But that's exactly what he's most interested in, is how does light fall across these different surfaces that he chooses to paint. And it's true through the totality of his career. He lives all the way to the 1920s, right? and is constantly interested in the relationship between the paint that comes out of his tubes and the effects of light that he can try and achieve on the canvas. Right? Now, as I mentioned, there were quite a few different artists in the Impressionist group, right? 30 to begin with. It was a revolving membership, right? There were 8 different shows over the course of 12 years by the group, the Society of Independent Artists, is what they called themselves, right? 8 different shows over the course of 12 years, which means obviously not every year, right? No artist was in all 8 shows, right? Camille Pissarro, Camille's a girl's name in the United States, it's a man's name in France, right? He was in 7 of the 8, so he comes closest as of anybody to being in every show, right? But he was not in every show, and he was more or less the old man of the group, although Monet was no spring chicken, right? When the Impressionists start, Monet's around 35 or so, right? But Pissarro was much older, and in fact, he often took younger artists under his arm and taught them things as they came to Paris. And so he was in 7 of the 8 shows, and he too paints in a sort of traditional Impressionist manner. Unbroken brushstrokes, broken brushstrokes, unblended, laid next to each other so that your eye pulls them together. A sense of an interest of a particular time of day, a particular play of light. Also seems to be escaping the city, although many Impressionists work deep in the heart of the city as well. And this image, the Ile-de-France is the area around Paris, right? Paris has, we have states, they have departments, right? Département. And the department around Paris is the Ile-de-France, the island of France. So this is the immediate rural vicinity of Paris, right? About 50 miles on every side of Paris is the Ile-de-France. And he shows us this, sort of a perfect farm, a harmonious farm, right? A farming couple, neatly stacked rows of hay. Man working in the back on a bale of hay. These haystacks all around. It reminds us the degree to which Impressionism owes a debt to the realist movement. Realism led to Impressionism, and Pissarro has very much some of the same interests in the rural working class as the Impressionists had had. Now, that said, Pissarro's focus, Pissarro's meaning, what does Pissarro see in these hay farmers? It's very different than the focus of Millet. So Millet is about the gleaners, right? Remember, the gleaners is about these impoverished rural workers who were graciously allowed, I'm speaking sarcastically, graciously allowed to go repick a field that had already been harvested. And anything the industrial farm had left behind was theirs to take. And they could use it to feed their families. Right? That's the focus. And what we see in the background are these massive bales of hay, the people that are working them. Now look at Pissarro. We have a couple in the foreground. It's almost like it's based on this work in a way, certainly referencing it. And we do see bales of hay in the background, kind of laid out in a not dissimilar fashion, right? But what's the difference? Who's working Pissarro's field? Who's working Millet's field? Right? The field has been harvested, and we see in the background this monster group of people, right? A man on horseback, marshaling them. They're working for somebody else, right? Their tents are behind him. And you've got the field boss. Heck, you've seen him in movie, like Cool Hand Luke, right? He's the guy with the mirrored sunglasses, He's keeping them on task because they're employees working for this industrial farm that is reaping all of these harvests. Now look at Pissarro. Who's working the field? They're the farmers who own the land, working for their own profit, not working for the profit of some boss somewhere. Now, Pissarro, we know, was the member of a rather radical political party in France, the sort of most radical leftist party in France at the time, that believed that any land ownership beyond the individual farmer was immoral. That the idea of acquiring land for industrial profiteering, right, was bad. That land should be owned by people who worked for their own profit, not for the profit of a bigger business. And that's exactly what he shows us. Right? Mom and pop farms, prosperous, but prosperous for themselves. No great hordes of field workers. No shift supervisors on horseback, right, making sure that the work is done. Because they're working for themselves. So no one has to make sure the work is done. Right? They are profiting from their own labor. This is exactly what politically Pissarro believed in. Right? That rural life was, in many ways, better than urban life. Because it allowed this connection with the land, and it allowed people to work in a more idealized state where they are working for themselves, rather than working for the profit of someone else. That's an ideal that he aspires to. That's an ideal that he holds to. I've got some details, and here you can see, I think, the degree to which some of the paint is laid over the top of other paint, right? That he's allowed parts of it to dry before he's come back over. If we look at the next to our farmer here, and you'll notice as well that even though they're bending over one another, there's a sense that the work itself is never all that difficult. That even though it's labor, it's not a toil. It's not back-breaking. It doesn't bend you over, drive you down, grind you up. Like Miet's gleaners have a sense, that this is grinding them up and spitting them out. But you can see, if you look at the paint next to him over here, the direction that he's looking, you can see these strokes that run this way over the top of strokes that run this way. Right? And that's paint laid over the top of already dried paint. Right? That's an indication of the degree to which the paint is built up in layers, thus not impressionistic, if you will, not spontaneous in any particular way. There are some spontaneous impressionist pictures, but the idea that Impressionism as a group is a spontaneous group of artists is really a mythology that has grown through the years. Everywhere we look, this is about prosperity, about harmony with the land, which reflects Pissarro's own political beliefs. So with Monet, right, we were talking about the fact that with Monet, sort of our most famous impressionist, the subject matter seems less important. He's a painter of light. Subject matter is still important, but less important than it had been, as the effects of light become the primary focus. Pissarro doesn't do the same thing. He doesn't pick one subject matter and paint it over and over and over again, like Monet had done. For Pissarro, the subject matter remains extraordinarily important, right? Because he believes in this way of life as a powerful antidote to industrialism that has changed the way of life in urban Paris, where he lives. Actually, Pissarro himself chooses to live outside of Paris as well, another area out on the Seine. Pontoise is the name of it, not that it matters. But often paints these farmlands around Paris. So Louveciennes is near Argenteuil, not too far away from that, along the Seine. And again, farmlands where people are working, but none of them ever seem all that shagged out by the work. None of them ever seem all that downtrodden, that the work for them is something that's fulfilling. And I think as we look through all of Pissarro's works, that's a motif that comes up again and again, is that rural farm labor is itself a sort of a moral activity. And it's one thing to read that into his pictures, but it's another thing when we understand where he stood politically, right? That he belonged to, it was called the Anarchist Party at the time, right? I don't believe they believed in sort of, red A anarchy, like you see with leftists today. But they didn't believe in an overthrow of government, right? But they did believe in opposing any governmental programs that supported wholesale takeover of family businesses for the massive profit of single corporations. Yeah.
I know we're just looking at two here, but is it a general pattern that the man is upright and the woman
I
is
was-
the one that's always
That's a good question, because I thought that same thing as I was looking at these, that they both give us very much exactly the same thing. On the left is the woman bent over, and on the right is the man standing, although he's bent a bit from he's carrying that bag, and he sort of stooped a bit in our picture on the left. But it's a really good question, and the only way we could find out would be to start to just do a wholesale look at these, right? As women versus men, and is there sort of a sexist, if you will, gender-based relationship of the two? And I don't know. I saw that for the first time. This fall, I'm doing a 400 level class on Impressionism, so I'll keep that in the back of my mind. Take it. This same time frame, writing intensive class, if you need one for your major, Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, looking entirely at National Gallery works, right, this fall. So I'll have a chance to look into that more, right? But yeah, it's an interesting question. One of the things that comes up out of that, Katrina, which is a very important element, which we'll talk about later this morning, is the role of women in France in the late 19th century. It was very sexist. As you might imagine, France is still kind of sexist in their way, right? And I can say that my wife's a French professor, so I can get away with that, right? That wholesale blanket thing. But in the 19th century, it was absolutely the codified, traditional, gender-based judgments of people's capabilities and roles. It was really extraordinarily unmodern, despite everything else that's becoming very modern. And during this period, the Third Republic, right after the ouster of Napoleon III, even before his ouster, right, and the Franco-Prussian War, which we talked about last week, women now this is urban society primarily. Farms are going to be different, right, because of the work that has to be done. But still, the attitudes towards women. Women were not allowed to go outside on their own without male accompaniment. If they did, they were seen as one of two things, right? Either like a washerwoman who, for their particular job, has to go outside, or a prostitute, right? And seeing them any other way was just sort of not even thought about. The independence of women didn't extend to the independence to be able to function in an urban society independently, right? It was still very misogynist, right? So when you ask that question about the stooped woman in both of these, one wonders how as leftist as Pissarro might have been in certain elements of his politics, did that translate into sort of proto-feminism? And I don't think that's the case, right? So it'd be worthwhile paying attention to as we look at images of labor, right? Whether or not it's only the women that get bent down by all of this, right? There was interest amongst the realists, right? So realist art doesn't go away when Impressionism starts. Realist art doesn't even go away when we get to Post-Impressionism. There's still realist artists all the way to the beginning of the 20th century. Not only in France, but in America, right? Artists that are interested in sort of this realist idea of contemporary events depicted in a sort of modern fashion, right? That's still around. So there's a group called the Ashcan School in New York and Philadelphia, America, right? Are doing realist pictures, into 1920s almost, right? Edward Hopper can be seen as sort of a latter-day realist, and he's in the 30s and 40s and 50s, right? 1930s and 40s and 50s, right? 100 years hence. So I've totally lost my train of thought. How did I get realist art? You're taking notes. Well, how did I get started on that?
It didn't go away.
The realist art didn't go away, but why was I bringing it up in the first place? I lost my train of thought. I had a train of thought, and it's gone out of the station. The realist agenda, interest in labor, right? That's shared with that is still maintained, right? A strong interest in labor is still maintained. And Pissarro gives us an interest in labor, but unlike the realists they were socialists. Let's get right down to it. I mean, they were 1848, right? Realist movement starts in 1848, okay? 1848 is a year of revolution in all of Europe, okay? So there's the third revolution in France. There's a revolution there's an uprising. There's a workers' uprising in England, same year. Karl Marx writes Communist Manifesto with Engels in 1848, right? And the Communist Manifesto, regardless of your take on it, what it said is that the history of civilization is a history of class struggle. And it advocates for the rights of the workers, right? Amongst many other things, okay? Like he hadn't got to state control and things like that. That wasn't his issue, but it was more about the idea of, and he's the one who talks about dialectical capitalism, which is where you work for the profit of someone else who pays you a minimal wage so that they can make more profit off of what you're producing, right? And some of these ideas are still kind of resonant. You know, there was an article in the Times this morning about or maybe it was this weekend, about we are like the one country in the world that's really hung up on the idea of socialism being a horrible negative, right? That's the McCarthyism, all the legacy of all of that, and also because we believe in free market capitalism, right? And that socialism runs against that. But even within free market capitalism, there's room for the idea of working for your own profit, right? Working for your own empowerment and betterment, right? These ideas are still out there. So back to this, right? The interest in the working poor came out of that issue, right? The working class, the focus on the working class. So when we looked at Manet, we've got a nanny, she's a working class woman, right? We've got a prostitute, she's a working class woman. We have people of leisure who've taken some time off on a Sunday, luncheoning on the grass. When we look at images of downtime, we are actually talking about work, right? When you look at leisure, you're still talking about work, because you're talking about the idea of the regimentation of work, which is something that happened during the same time period. With industrialization came the idea of work being regimented, the idea of punching the clock. You start at 8, you end at 5, right? That didn't exist before you were working for someone else, right? When you're working for yourself, the work starts when the work calls you to, and the work is over when you're done, right? Not when the shift is over. Right? And there's something to be said about that, right? One of the things, my job, I don't punch the clock here. I'm here all the time. I complain about being here all the time, right? But I get here when I need to be here, when the work calls me. There's no one upstairs that says you've got to be here, except for when I schedule my own classes, right? I have to be here at 7 on Monday morning because I'm the one who gave myself an 8 o'clock class, right? And that's okay. And I leave when I'm done, right? And I usually take the work, my work is like the Munster Mobile. There's always the cloud following me around. Does that reference me anything to anybody? The Munsters, right? They had the cloud following, always raining on the Munster Mobile. My work is always following me around, but I work, I'm doing what I want to do, right? Whether I'm bending over or not. And it's not done. It's not, I don't clock out, right? Per se. And nobody checks my time card, right? So many issues around labor are really kind of important, are really formulated here in the 19th century. And many of these pictures are dealing with the issues of labor, right? Work as a theme running through a great number of these pictures, right? And Pissarro has particular ideas about labor that infect what he's painting, right? In the same way that we think that many people had ideas about industry and its effect on the country, on the environment, right? And we've seen that play out in many different ways as we looked at works of art, right? So, labor remains a very, very strong theme for, I think, many of the Impressionists, right? Even if we're talking about images of leisure, sailboats, right, and whatnot. The idea of a leisure time only comes up when you have the idea of clocked work time, right? That's when it becomes much more, casts much more into relief. Labor, right? We tend not to think of ballet as labor, but it is. And ballerinas, right, in the 19th century, they were called theater rats, right? They were the grunts. The idea of the prima donna didn't really exist in the 19th century, right? They usually came from working class backgrounds. They usually had little to no education. These young girls that came from these working class backgrounds were being kept out of really rotten other possibilities, like prostitution. And they would get sponsors that would help to bring them into the ballet as a way to not become a washerwoman, right? And they weren't necessarily looked up to in the way of, Misty Copeland or whatever it is today, as sort of a prima donna, if you will, a star, right? And Degas is very much interested in ballet as labor, ballet as work. And he's another founding member. He's one of the original 30 or so Impressionists, right, in 1873, who get together to form the first Impressionist show, right? And I think this one was in the first Impressionist show. Right? And like Monet, he's very much, like Pissarro was interested in labor, like Monet, he's interested in repetitions. He loves doing the same thing over and over and over again. And for him, it's maybe not entirely about the fall of light, although that's an issue. Like, look at how the light wafts through the floorboards. Look at the shadows cast by the ballerinas as they're closer to the windows and how that shadow dissipates out. He is very much interested in the fall of light in this interior space. But that's not the major focus, right? So as he repeats themes, for him, the major focus becomes the human body in motion. And as we look at all of Degas' works, and I wish we had time to look more of them at this late date in the class, as we look at all of his works, what we find is that he's interested in professionals, professional athletes in particular, professional actors of one form or another, huge series of ballerinas. This allows him to study the human body. And huge series of horse races. Huge series of prostitutes. And all of them, this is I think the fascinating thing about Degas. He doesn't show them performing. Well, the prostitutes make sense, that'd just be pornography, right? But with the ballerinas, it's behind the scenes. It's practicing. It's waiting to perform. What he's interested in is these professionally trained bodies doing normal things. His horse race pictures are in the paddock, waiting for the race. There are very, very few active horse races. Maybe it's because that's where he could capture them, because they're not moving around so quickly, right? That it's easier to draw them while at rest. But also it shows, I think, that he's very much interested in these trained bodies, trained to do something. And in addition to painting them, he made models. He made wax models of ballerinas in action. Right? And in each of these images, he's showing us a very privileged point of view. This is not a world where men are usually allowed. The only people who could go backstage were the monetary supporters of the ballet. Because the way the system worked was you become interested in a ballerina, and you would support her specifically, give money for schooling, food, whatever, right? And if you did that, you were that sugar daddy, I guess, for lack of a better word, that patron of the arts that gave you backstage access. And that's the view that Degas gives us, even though we know he was not one of these patrons, right? He gives us that privileged backstage access. He allows us to be a patron of the arts, a patron of the ballet, looking backstage. Right? So what's coming up next? These are probably not painted there. He's probably not setting up an easel in the ballet studio. He'd be in the way, for one. Right? It's the same reason they don't want you setting up easels in the National Gallery, right? It's because you're going to get in the way of other people around there. Imagine if they're dancing and practicing, and all of a sudden there you are in the way, right? So he's probably just doing sketches there and composing them back in the studio. The other way we know he's composing in the studio is the degree to which he'll do repeat compositions and figures in picture after picture. And by repeat, I mean unlike Monet, where that bridge doesn't move, Degas will paint the same figure in the same pose in multiple pictures, which suggests that he's got a sketch he's working from, rather than 4 different canvases in the dance class. I'm going to show you one to compare with this, but I wanted to look at this for 1 second longer. One of the things that Degas is doing in these 2 pictures, and in really a lot of his pictures, is really making some rather extraordinary and groundbreaking and innovative and I would say risky compositional choices. Okay? If you think about the traditional way pictures are composed, it's usually about symmetry, right? You got a nativity scene in the middle, and the figures are arranged, and the perspective sort of sweeps in gradually from each side. Well, in the dance lesson on the left, look at how much of the composition is the open space between things. That green wall, right? How he does these areas where the perspective doesn't quite work, where the space plunges drastically from figures in the foreground to a tiny group of figures in the background that are tucked into a corner somewhere. In the dance class on the right, which came out of the Corcoran collection, part of the swag when the Corcoran closed, that staircase on the left, right? That's cut off. And how many of the figures we don't see? The legs coming down the stairs, the legs behind the spiral staircase, down below some standing figures. Is there room for the rest of their bodies behind that? I'm not so sure, right? This area right here. Or the legs that are kicking up behind them over here. And the body's just blocked away by this. It's really kind of interesting way of blocking things that on a certain level suggests spontaneity again, right? Almost suggests like camera work, where it's taking a snapshot with a handheld camera. And by the 1870s, we know Degas owned a camera, right? Now, the problem is that the exposure time was so long that getting snapshots, like we're used to taking with our phones, right, was not a real possibility for people. So he's sort of inventing this artifice of these spontaneous compositions, as if they're sort of consciously uncomposed, at least not traditionally composed, right? By giving us these things that are cut off, right, that suggest spontaneity. The right-hand corner, look at here, this half girl, right, cut out of the frame. Go back to any Renaissance picture, you find the half figures, maybe some mannerist stuff that's cut off here, but they don't get cut off, halfway through their face, right, or halfway through their body. And Degas is doing that, and it adds, like Monet's brushwork, right? It adds a sense of sort of a fleeting nature, a spontaneous moment in time that he's captured, right? And for him, it's capturing motion, right? the figures of these girls. Now, again, this is all artificial because he will do. This is in Scotland. This is in Glasgow, right? And you can see it's pretty much the exact same composition. He's moved some things around, right? We've got our same spiral staircase on the left, lit differently, but also blocking some of the figures behind it. Some of them are in the exact same poses. We've got the dance teacher now huddling over here, or she's missing in this one. And the space is articulated somewhat differently, which suggests he's creating it, right? He's playing with the interior space to make these different compositions, to open up that area in the back on the right, to put those figures there when it's not what he actually saw. And that's an important element about painting that becomes more prominent as we move to the modern era. And that's this idea that a painting is not necessarily what we see. That a painting is an artist's interaction, dialogue with stuff, surfaces. It's often inspired by what we see, but the idea that it has to reflect exactly what we see is not what the artists are trying to do. Right? This interior space is a fabrication. It's based on observation, but the bottom line, the final end result, is that it's got to work as a composition. That regardless of what you saw, if that is getting in the way of it, if I were painting this room and that window wasn't working and the green was overwhelming everything, I would have to change it as an artist. Even if it made it look less realistic, even if it was less true to what I observed. Because my responsibility as an artist is to the picture, not to the thing that I saw that inspired me. Right? And this is the lesson of Degas, right? Is his obligation is to the composition. And he's willing to make changes based on that, right? Shift things around in the background. Now, his brush strokes, his brush work, very much like Monet's, is broken and open and unblended, right? So when he paints these, either the tutus or the ribbons or the coats over the top, as we get closer to them, we can see the act of painting. Because he doesn't bother to blend them, there's no attempt to make the paint look like the object. The paint still looks like paint. You know, these works that adds to the sense of spontaneity. A nice detail of our staircase, which we've already talked about, adding to the sense of spontaneity. Now, what we've been talking about today are artists who are trying to make a modern art that reflects the new modern experience, right? That's kind of been a motif throughout the entirety of the day. Modern, our artists in the late 19th century are aware of the fact that their world is different from their forefathers' world. And they're trying to make a work of art that reflects the new experience, the modernity of life, right? The modernness of it all. And part of it is focusing on new subject matters like the working class, right? Part of it is that. Part of it is painting in non-traditional ways, right? Manet, Monet, broken brush strokes, right? Critics hated it because it was non-traditional. Mucking around with perspective, right? Perspective had been there ever since Brunelleschi, right? Ever since the 1410s. Perspective has been how artists created the space for the activities that we see in their paintings. Has been with the idea of one-point perspective, right? Two-point perspective sometimes, but usually the idea of mathematical perspective that creates a logical, rational, three-dimensional space. Beginning with the realists, we start to see artists mess with that, right? Where there'll be space jumps, where things don't work within a rational, unified space. Right? All of these are ways in which artists are breaking with tradition to make a modern art. They don't want to make works that continue to do exactly what works had done for hundreds of years, because modern experience is so different. So for Degas, right, and for many of the Impressionists, one of the things they began to look toward are what are some other ways to create pictures that don't rely on traditional Western construction methods, right? One-point perspective, lay out the figures in space. What are some other things I can look at that might open my eyes to a new way to do this? And for Degas, Japanese prints. These started flooding into Paris right around the 1850s or so, right? So these are brand new works of art coming out of Japan. And they're not highly valued. Sometimes they're used as packing papers even for things that are arriving at port in Paris. And they're seeing things. Hiroshige is by far probably the most radical of them. But you'll notice the way in which he blocks things, right? He gives us this gate to the port, and we see the people moving around behind it. And there's a certain sort of spontaneousness to the way he blocks figures by this. And how the area, as the space moves forward, we see those ships, boats in the harbor, and the islands leading out to the mouth of the port, and the ships going off into the horizon. How there's a sort of flatness to the depth. Does that make sense? Look at the water, and you'll see that there's nothing to suggest that the water's going back in space. There's no lines there. Your mind puts it together, right? Or the foreground, there's a bit of that fade to burgundy at the bottom, but there aren't any elements there that tell us that space is going back in. You just understand it that way, right? And what ends up happening is that certain sections of this is just a block of blue, right? Now look at Degas, and look at the floor, and how the floor moves back, and kind of, as it moves back, it also sort of moves up into space. He's getting a lot of this from looking at non-Western art, in particular Japanese art, is huge for him. And what it presented, even though it's new art, right, it presented for him another way of creating space, creating compositions that didn't rely on Renaissance traditions, that didn't rely on the way things have always been done. And allowed him, as he injected those lessons into his pictures, to make an art that was different, an art that was modern for the modern world. A couple of these, because we don't see enough non-Western art in this class. Another Hiroshige print, where we can see that same sort of radical jumps in space with a sense of foreground elements blocking our view, right? Blocking the view of ostensibly what we're supposed to be looking at, right? The boats in the harbor here, the dancers there, right? Each one of these brings something right into the foreground that just gets in the way of seeing the things we're supposed to be looking at, right? We have two more impressions to look at. Mary Cassatt, as an American, was very, very good friends with Degas. Her family had moved to Paris. Her father was a businessman. When she was like 20 or so, the entire family moved to Paris. She spent most of the rest of her life there. Came back to America, worked for American patrons as well, but was invited by Degas to join the Impressionists. Right? It's like the second year of the Impressionist show, 1876 show. He invited Cassatt to join her, and he and Cassatt remained friends for a very long time, right? Very, very close. And you can sort of see a similarity in layout to Cassatt's Girl in the Blue Armchair, to Degas' dance class. How the floor seems to sort of tip up, and the figures sort of loosely arranged around it, almost as if they're sort of casually arranged. Maybe as if they're not arranged, but uncomposed. And then Cassatt gives you that sort of, it almost like a South America cutout of the floor. This sort of olive-colored floor that is, there's nothing in it to model it, to suggest it's going back in space. All it is this flat area that seems to tip the floor up almost as if it's parallel with the picture plane, like we're looking down at it rather than looking at going back into space. Right? Degas and Cassatt worked sort of side by side often, right? And there was a big show at the National Gallery a few years back that talked about the fact that he was making suggestions to her about how to change the composition to make it work better, right? And often this seems to have helped quite a bit, although she's really very, very good on her own. Right? So here, a girl in a blue armchair. Again, the sort of random, scattered arrangement of the furniture suggests probably that she's also looking at Japanese prints, right? The scattered arrangement of the islands and the boats as the horizon line has been raised up toward the top of the composition. That's true in the blue armchair as well. And then we get this flat area of blue working its way down against which we get these three-dimensional elements, right? Now look at the blue armchair. You see exactly the same sort of idea. Right? Certainly, it seems as if it's through Degas that Cassatt got to know these things, right? That she's benefiting from her connection with him. As a member of the Impressionism group, she also is very much interested in sort of how paint works, how color can give a sense of spontaneity, and her brushwork is extraordinary. I mean, Cassatt is a fantastic painter, right? Especially here in her early years. She morphs a bit around 1900, but you can see that the pattern on the chair, which comes off as a pattern on the different chairs, ends up as we get close to be just random areas of paint applied wet on wet as well, truly spontaneously applied. Now with Cassatt, we have an interesting issue. It'd be a great place to sort of end class today. And that is, as a woman artist, and I hate saying that because it makes it sound like if I don't say woman, artist means man. But as a woman painter, Cassatt had more opportunities in Paris than she did in America. The Impressionists, because they were breaking the rules, because they were non-traditional, because they had gotten outside of the stranglehold of the Royal Academy, the Impressionists were very open to women artists, right? Whereas the salons were much less welcoming, right? And so even though there aren't many, there are about 4 or 5 women amongst the Impressionists, the fact that there are 4 or 5 is itself pretty extraordinary. Given that up to this point we've seen 2 or 3, all told every country we've looked at. Right? We've seen 2 or 3. Rosa Bonheur, one of the few who was able to work within the salon system. Right? Otherwise we had to go to Holland or England to find women artists. Italy. Right? The Impressionists were open to women. Right? And they had more opportunity there than they would have in most other groups of painters. That said, French society, less welcoming, which we've already talked about, right? And so that makes this picture for me a really great metaphor in a certain level, because Cassatt, Monet, Pissarro, they can go set up an easel outside and start a picture, bring it back to the studio, finish it up. Right? They can sit outside by themselves. Painting is a very solitary experience, you know. I always bring sketchbooks when I travel with my wife, but I never use them because if I do, I'm not paying attention to my wife, right? I'm paying attention to this thing in front of me because I'm drawing, right? And that's it's an engaging, involving experience, right? But it requires that you get out there and you dive into it by yourself. And so that's why it's always a pain in the ass when people come up and say, "What's that you're drawing?" You know, because it's like just go. I'm like the girl with the book in the railway. Just no. Cassatt can't do that. She can't go sit outside with an easel and paint what's in front of her. Okay? It's an impossibility. The social structures are such that even a woman with an easel, which is obviously not a prostitute, obviously not a washerwoman, right? Of the poorest of the working classes, the most downtrodden of the working classes. Even though she's not that, The structures were such that it was still not acceptable. Just not acceptable. So Cassatt paints instead her experience, right? Impressionist pictures of her world. And when you look at the blue armchair picture, I think this is an extraordinary picture. It's one of my favorite pictures of the NGA. It's just great, right? But how would you characterize the look on that girl's face? Does she like being inside? Khadijah? No. Is she relaxed? This is a terrific picture the more you think about it, right? We've got the puppy dog. One of the few times I'm not going to show you a detail of the puppy dog, right? We've got the puppy dog. He's curled up on a dogs love chairs, and he's relaxed and comfortable. But she's just fidgety, right? She's squirmy. She's sliding off the chair, pouty, right? She's all dressed up. She's ready to go out, right? Her socks match her cummerbund, She's ready to go out, but she's been told she can't, right? And she's stuck here just sort of inside, right? And it isn't, for me, it's impossible to look at this picture and not think about Cassatt's experience as an artist, right? Wanting to be outside, unable to go there. And once you sort of key in on that theme, right, of Cassatt painting from her experiences, and what we know about late 19th century French culture and her inability to be a landscape painter a la Monet or Pissarro. And we start to look at the rest of her pictures. It just becomes obvious that this theme of inside-outside, right, of being dressed up but having to wait for someone to accompany you before you can go out, is an extraordinarily strong theme that runs through her works that we don't see in the works of Monet, that we don't see in the works of Degas, we don't see it in the works of Pissarro. A sort of sense of what society outside means for some people, but not for her. Her dog here, it looks like the same dog, drawn a bead on something. There's squirrels, or maybe just people walking, right? I know this. Dogs, they sit at the window and they bark because they want people to come to them, right? They're not barking because they're mad at us. They're saying, come over here, play with me. And he's seeing something, he's waiting, and she's waiting as well, There's this great psychological involvement about what it means to be inside, outside, right? That runs through her works, yeah.
Do you think it also is related to the history of women having those journals, journals?
The idea of, and very good question. I've not seen anybody write about that. But I can see where that's exactly the point. So the question, if you didn't hear, was, could this idea of chronicling her experiences, right, through surrogates, if you will, in these interiors, could it relate to journaling as an activity? I can't see. I'd be hard pressed to say it isn't. But I've never seen anybody really investigate it. So that's really fascinating. Talk to Doug. I'll talk to Doug and find out about these. That's a really great question. It seems as if perhaps it is. There's something autobiographical about it in a way, right? Chronicling the everyday experience. The interesting thing for that, Katrina, is that the other prominent woman in the Impressionists, Berthe Morisot, who's French, also has very much kind of the same idea, right? Inside, outside. So here again, waiting, whiling away the hours, undertaking these activities. The most out of doors you can get is your balcony. And you can see here with Morisot, she even gives us across the way, right? We see other people at the windows engaging in a very, very similar activity. Right? We got 4 minutes left. One last picture, we'll wrap this up. What do we do with this? Right? I really like this picture. It's just extraordinarily beautifully painted in the sort of things we've talked about with Impressionism, right? But it's a fascinating picture because it shows us everything I just said didn't exist. It shows us a woman alone outside. So what do we do with this? How do we deal with this picture? Keep in mind, right, the Impressionists are not always working outside, right? We saw that with Monet. We saw that with Pissarro. That sometimes the illusion of, their understanding of color and light, their application of paint, gives us the illusion that they're working outside. But that's not always the case, even for the men, right? That out of practicality, you finish things up inside, right? It starts to rain. What do you then do, So we have this impression that this is painted outside, right? And apparently it's fairly accurate to what Lorient looked like then. Lorient, Allies bombed the heck out of Lorient in World War II because the Nazis had taken it over and were using it as it sits right on the Atlantic. It's in Brittany, right? So it feeds out to the Atlantic. It's a huge port. And so everything we see here is not there anymore, right? If you were to go. But it certainly is apparently accurate to what Lorient looked like in the 19th century. Okay? So she certainly has gone outside sketching, right? We know that Degas would go out with Cassatt often, right? When they go to the Louvre together to look at pictures. And that is, we think, her sister, right? Although the face is so abstractly painted, it's hard to say for sure. How do we read this picture? What do we do with it? Part of me thinks that it's a subversive picture. That it paints the way Morisot thinks it ought to be. That rather than painting what she might actually see, she's created a scene wherein women can be outside. We have to imagine that if this were painted outside, there's this narrative that suggests that Morisot is there with her, so there's two of them together, but that doesn't necessarily make a huge difference. One of the things that's been brought up, and this is what we'll end with, is even if it's a scene that is idealizing the way it should be, there's something rather psychologically complicated about the arrangement of space. Look where she is relative to the world. All the way off the right, all the way against the margin, on a wall, separated from the city by an expanse of water. Tiny little figures on the opposite bank. That's what she's looking at. She's shielded. She's shielded. She's got the umbrella. Everything around her creates a sort of cocoon of space, safety around her. And if we think about that idea, that somehow this ideally created space where a woman could be outside is one that still has to be cordoned off from the rest of the world. Right? See, maybe is part of what Morisot's working with here. She signs it on the wall. Her signature is right here, as if it were written on the wall. Right? That's outside for her. Right? That's what it means to be an Impressionist artist. So I think that on a certain level, even though we don't have an interior space here, we have the creation of, by Morisot, something that we can look at as being wish fulfillment, if you will. And a dream of the way things ought to be. Okay, post-impressionism on Friday. We'll see how far through that we get. We'll talk a bit about the final, Thursday, sorry. We'll talk a bit about the final on Thursday as well. I'll update the slide list, and I'll make sure I get that PowerPoint for you later today. I got a couple student meetings this morning, and then after that, I'll get on it.